All right, so here we are on the bench, and I've already done a bunch of the rods, as you can see, but I wanted to pull one out and show you kind of what's involved here. So let me pull the cap off. Now these are the K1 rods. This is for the Duratec 2 liter. And just pop the cap off. Now let's see if this will show up, but you can see there's some writing there. These sides should always match, but I've also marked each rod for its individual cylinder. So this is for cylinder 1. I've already put our bearings in, and you can see some kind of witness marks there. I'll get to that in a second. Put that back together. Now, to figure out how tight this tolerance needs to be, what I had to do is put these rods together, each and every one, torque down the rod cap so it was tight, which meant I think it was like 30 foot-pounds on the rod bolt plus whatever 60 degrees, and then it gives a bolt stretch measurement. And what that is that's this guy. And so as you can see, I have it zeroed out here. And so this is how long the bolt would be if it's not in the rod. If there's no tension on it, nothing pulling this bolt farther up. But if we just move this by hand and push it up a bit, you can see as we apply force, it would grow in length by a little bit. And these are in 10 thousandths. So the torque spec for these is you want them to grow by 5 to 6 thousandths in length. So when they're tightened in the rod, it should be 5 to 6 thousandths longer than it should be when there's no tension on the bolt whatsoever. And I had to do that for each bolt, 2 for each rod, and that sets our final torque measurement for the big end of the rod. And why that's important is we needed to get the bearings here in the rod. We needed the rod torqued to spec, so this area is round like it's supposed to be, and that allowed us to take a measurement inside the bore. Now this isn't going to be right because it's wider now, but there's a couple different ways you could take this measurement. You could use the inner diameter measurement on like a set of dial calipers to measure this. You could use a depth finding or a inner diameter gauge like this one. Set it in here. You unscrew that guy. Oh, yeah, there it goes. So you set it in there, tighten it using that set screw, and then make sure that it doesn't rattle around in there. You pull it out, and then you measure how wide this guy is with a set of dial calipers. That's a longer way to do it, but that also works, and it's a little bit nicer to use one of these than these sharp edges on a set of dial calipers. And as you can see, I already had some witness marks in there from demonstrating it both ways. But that is how we find our inner diameter on the rods, and then we can compare that to our outer diameter on the rod journals on our crank. So I've done all of the legwork already because I didn't want you guys to sit through all that. And here is our measurements, if I can not bump the camera. So on our rod big ends, this is what we measured out for each rod. So they measured out to 1.852 inches pretty much across the board. And that is with the bearings installed. And the crank was 1.846 inches across the board. So that leaves us with basically 6 thousandths clearance for all of our big end rod bearings. So that's looking good everywhere else. You can sort of see that I've cheated and I've gone ahead and did the rings, but I'm going to talk about that next. Here's how I did our piston rings. So first up, bring everything over here. I have the piston ring down in the bore, and it's easy enough to do. Just put it in the bore, level it out with a piston, and then that'll set your ring at a height where you can take a measurement for the gap. Now it's really hard to see in there, but this is our secondary ring, and it should be about 23 thousandths, just like that. And that's how you want to check that gap, is you put a feeler gauge in there, and let's say it was a little too narrow, maybe 16 thousandths instead of 23 thousandths. Well, you'll need to open up that gap, and that's what this tool over here is for. So this is a piston ring grinder, and what you'll do is you hold the ring up against the disc here, turn the grinding wheel by hand, and you want to be careful because you're talking about taking off a couple of thousandths at a time, so it doesn't take a whole lot to do that. But once you're done, you'll take your piston ring back over and fit it back in the block. Now this set of piston rings, this is for our number 1 piston, and we're checking it in the number 1 bore. And we've done this for all the pistons, all of the rings, so everything is set correctly. So if you look at our totals here, I've set the gap for each of our rings, got our oil rings set. So all of the pistons are ready to go. That leaves us with basically getting on with the head now. So our bottom end is done, our pistons are done, our rods are done. So next up, we need to get on with the head, and we'll get the head torn apart and get our new hardware installed. All right, so here we have the head on the bench. I started with the first 2. I don't know how much of this I'm actually going to film because it's a giant pain, but I'll show you what I've got and why we're switching. So the first set, the first pair are done. Got these guys installed. This is part of the tool to pull the valve springs out. Here's a look at the old ones. So these are the stock valve springs, the stock seals that are 75 and change thousand miles old, and then our old retainers in the top of these guys. Oh, that's the seal. Retainers on this end. So that's the valve spring retainer. Onto the new stuff. So new seals, new valve springs, and new titanium retainers. So this all came from SuperTech. Actually, again, I got all this stuff from Fab 9. Ordered it from them, but these are SuperTech springs, dual springs, as you can see, with their titanium retainers. And what these get me is more spring pressure. So these aren't as big, you can see, as the old ones. They're a little bit shorter. However, with the dual spring, they are significantly stiffer, you could say. It takes a lot more to push these things down. So that being said, I forgot a bit. There should be 2 of these guys down. These are spring seats that need to go on top of the valve seat here so that this sits properly. And that gets us our correct installed height for the added spring pressure to go with the bigger cams that we got. Again, that'll let us rev it a little bit higher. It'll control the valves better at higher RPM and higher lift, more importantly. But the biggest pain is trying to get these little valve locks, as you can see, to sit around the valve stem with this guy and compressing the spring. That's the part that's such a pain. Actually, another thing is I don't want to flip the head over one-handed, but while I'm at it, I'm actually pulling the valves and cleaning them up and the valve seat area just to make sure that everything's as refurbished as we can get it before we put this engine all the way together. So I'm going to keep going on this, and I'll pick up the camera again once I'm done. Got the all the new springs in, the new valve seals, all the parts now from the SuperTech stuff is all installed. I've already got the buckets back in place on the exhaust side. Now I'll do the intake side. As you can see, I've labeled each of the buckets so I know where they came from and where they go back. The hope is that our clearances will be close, at least close enough that I won't need to change all of them and just swap out any of these that I need. Actually, that reminds me. So if you look underneath the bucket, I don't know how well that's showing up, but there's some writing and that little button in the middle. Well, each of these is precision ground for clearance on the valve stem to set the distance from the top of the bucket to the back side of the cam on the base circle. And that's where you set your clearance. But we don't know what that is yet, because I need to, now that all the new springs are in, I need to measure that with our old buckets, and we'll see how close we get. And then if I need to swap any out or move any around, like if some are too much or too little, I might be able to swap places and make up for the shortcomings that way. But we have everything done here on the head, so now clean up these journals, get some cam lube ready, and we'll lube this guy up and get our cam installed. Okay, so we're ready to get the cam in. We've cleaned up our journals, got our caps ready to go. In the absence of any special like cam lubricant, just an engine assembly lube like a moly grease will suffice. And you don't have to like hose it in there, but you want a somewhat liberal application, because this is going to serve as your engine oil per se until you get any kind of lubrication going through the engine. And so what I'm going to do is just quickly apply some of this to all of our journals, all our cam journals, retainers, etc. Get all this prepped and ready to go. Again, I don't know how well this is showing up, but this is all you really need. You're going to smooth it out with your finger in a bit. You don't have to go super crazy with it. So first, take our cap. Just going to smear that in there nice. And what this does is, in the absence of any pressurized oil, this will help prevent aggressive wear or metal-to-metal contact while you're turning the engine over during the build process or that first fire up. It's not meant to be a lasting lubrication at all. It's just a temporary measure. And then lastly, we want to apply just a little bit to the top of these buckets, because this is metal to metal. Even though the cam makes a swiping motion, it's going to make a mess when we measure it later. I don't care. It's just better to have it on there now. All right, and then lastly on our cam, we want to give our cam journals, or bearing surfaces rather, the same kind of a treatment. Just smear it on there nice. And again, it doesn't need to be a ton because it's all going to come off anyway and go straight into the oil when we first fire up the engine. All right, so now our cam is ready to go. This is our stage 2 cam. You can tell this is the intake cam because it's got the timing wheel on the back. It's not going to sit perfectly flat because some of the valves will be open. We just want to set it in place. Get our caps ready. The idea is we want to slowly tighten these and go around until everything's tightened up. Even though it'll, press some of the valves down, that's okay. We just want to make sure that we get our cam in place and get our bearing journals all tightened up. And then we can go about measuring our clearance on all the buckets. Cinch these up again, not tight, just take up the slack. Now we're going to go through and just tighten these little by little so we can evenly distribute the force across the bearing journals and the cam. And there we go. So now they're tight, but they're not torqued down. And then the next step is we can install our timing wheel for now, but you can see it's not keyed or anything. And this will be important when we set our timing later. But for now, we can just put it on the cam. There we go. We have our intake cam installed. Now I'll do the same for the exhaust, and we'll be ready to do some measurements. All right, so off of the bench and onto the block. I had to put it on the block so that I could pull these cams into position and get our timing bar put in place. But I noticed another problem, which is this. The intake cam that I got is for a variable valve timing intake engine, and this one was not. I don't know if I can simply just swap the gear for basically another fixed gear like this that does not have the adjustable timing part to it. But I'll need to look for that and see if that's an option. Otherwise, I'll have to send this set of cams back and get the proper ones. So I haven't torqued anything down yet because I got to sort of determine the fate of this front timing wheel or front chain wheel, and then we can go from there. Not a total blocker though, because I got the block ready to go now. The head is ready to go for the most part, barring the cam gear. But that means I can get started on the bottom end now. So I can get the crank put in, get that bottom girdle on, get everything torqued down, get our rods and pistons in, and basically prep the bottom end, the short block, while I figure out what's going on with the head. And then once those are done, we're pretty much getting closer to a finished motor. There's a few more things we're waiting on for the car. Those are shipped out, but delayed by, holiday and everything else is going on. But the hope is that I can get the engine and transmission in the car and hopefully get it started sooner than later. Because the Ultima parts should be here any day now. They should be here either this week or next. I've been following the vessel, the shipping vessel that has those parts. It's currently off the coast of Peru and headed northward, so we'll see how long it takes to get here. For now, I think I'm going to call it for this part of the engine build. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.